I'm here today with Keri Day. She is Associate Professor of Theological and Social Ethics and Black Church Studies at Bright Divinity School at Texas Christian University, and Visiting Associate Professor in those same disciplines here at Yale Divinity School, where we are having a conversation today on the future of theology, broadly construed. Keri, if I may, so great to have you with us.
I'm happy to be here. It's like being home. I was here 10 years ago as a student. So.
Yes, you're back. When I say theology broadly construed, and there's some conversation these days, who kind of counts as a theologian? Who wants that title? Who's afraid of that title? And we can have those conversations within various scholarly guilds. But I think it plays out also like out in the real world, as well. When you meet someone on an airplane, or and they ask you what you do for a living, what do you say and why, and what sort of conversation do you end up having?
Yeah, so interestingly, of course, this always comes up in an airplane where you're sitting on top of each other in the seats.
Often on your way to a theological conference.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely. With the book in hand, you're
right.
reading on something, and they're very interested in what you're reading. For the most part, when people ask me what I do, I tend to say a professor of religious studies, which serves as sort of a departure point, at least for me, because of course, the first thing they're going to say, oh, so you preach, right? That's sort of the first response that I get. It's sort of this confessional sense of what I do. And so that gives me an opportunity to say, well, actually, I am a minister within a particular tradition. But in terms of teaching, my teaching is more about how religion shows up in various spheres of life, and the importance of the religious variable, sort of in a country and in a generation where this sort of secularization thesis is operative, in which religion is seen as something that is not really essential or necessary or influential within social, political, or even economic affairs. And so it gives me an opportunity at least to introduce the variable of religion, because as we keep talking and we get over to the confessional piece about me as a minister, that's normally when I introduce theology, honestly. As at least for me, an understanding of theology in the tradition of Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King, Emily Towns, Dolores Williams, as sort of God talk, but in some ways thinking about God's activity in relationship to the world, and more specifically how the church sees itself as a part of that activity. So it allows me to go from sort of the broad into the particular in relationship to theology. And it's always interesting when I'm having these discussions with people.
Yeah, so you can go sort of the more anthropological kind of route. Well, I'm studying this kind of future in society. You can go the more confessional route, and depending on your interlocutor,
now
they may try to steer you in one of those ways. Yeah.
Now I have gone, I must admit this, I have gone the confessional route from the beginning. And it becomes a very sometimes stressed discussion. It's been my experience. Maybe it's because I'm sitting by the wrong people, but it's become a much more stressed discussion, sort of immediately interpreting what I do as sort of parochial, tribal in terms of views. I mean, in some ways, unfortunately, the visibility of certain kinds of religious fundamentalisms, that's what people tend to associate with the study of faith, particularly Christian faith. And so it could be the reason why I start is in relationship to these assumptions that people have, that I'm encountering.
Yeah. So we're here for these 24, 30 hours to talk about kind of the future of theology, and we're going to have plenty of time to talk about what's worrisome or troublesome, and in the document that Miroslav and I have circulated to help kind of frame our conversation, we name a few of those things. But all right, let's wait just a moment for that at least, and start with what's going right in theology. As you look at the landscape, each of us, we're located somewhere different. As you, from your vantage point, what's going right? What do we have to celebrate within the theological disciplines?
Absolutely. Well, of course, I would imagine this answer will be biased by depending on which area you're in. And as a Christian ethicist and, of course, a Black religious scholar, to me, I think what is going right, I'm really excited about, and of course, my work, my actual intellectual work centers around this, is sort of the revival of political theology as well as public theology. And this revival not being just among ethicists proper, right? Sort of the domain of what ethicists do, but it's being revived by theologians. There are theologians that are beginning to do this incredibly important work, as well as people, I think, who would identify themselves as religious scholars, but that they're doing work in political theology, that are teaching in Department of Religion programs. And so to me, I think what's right about that is that perhaps the field, the discourses, as well as the thinkers are understanding that in some ways theology and the political or the social are sort of co-constituted. They're inextricably linked, right? It's not as if sort of the first order is sort of theology and then sort of sitting over here is the political, and simply it's about sort of relating these radically discrete and separate conversations, but how they're inextricably linked and mutually inclusive. And to me, there's something right about that. And I think another amazing thing about the revival of political theology, public theology, is that it is placing at the center what perhaps decolonial or post-colonial theologians will refer to as a subaltern voice. Now, I'll say this, that I think, and I know you said we'll get to this today, but all the things that are wrong, I still think there's some ways to go in terms of sort of an epistemic intervention into how we're thinking about our theological and even epistemological categories in relationship to the subaltern voice. But I do think that the subaltern voice is moving to the center in a way that I am finding generative and fruitful for theology.
So, as you said, you've already anticipated some of this. So, obviously, there's still work to be done going in that direction. What else kind of gives you pause, or has you kind of troubled or worried about the kind of state of theology as it is right now?
And I'd hate to sound redundant because I'm part of how I perceive this consultation is precisely about this. But for me, what still troubles me is this idea that that theology, as in the department area of theology, let's say ethics, let's say the history of Christianity, is something separate from practical theologies. And so I guess here what I'm getting at is kind of the disciplinary parameters, how we understand particular fields. And to me, I think what gives me pause and what is troublesome is this sense that they are so radically alienated from one another, and this is seen in the how we structure the areas within our institutions in and of themselves. That somehow theology proper, ethics, perhaps the history of Christianity, maybe philosophy of religion is seen as more abstract, as more philosophical, as more, and then sort of you have the practical stuff over there dealing with. And so for me, there is a sense in which sort of, for the Greeks, that philosophy was just not about sort of intellectual contemplation, but it was about the good life. It was about the formation of oneself and virtue and so forth within societal life. And so that gives me pause, and I'm really interested to see. I do know that in some institutions, they're actually rethinking that altogether, which is really great. Like, for example, Emory University, Candler School of Theology, a good friend of mine. He also served as my dissertation reader. Second, but Ted Smith. I went to Vanderbilt. He was there at the time. He has a position in ethics and preaching, right? So what does it mean to re-envision how one is doing ethics, both philosophical, theological, and social ethics in relationship to preaching, but to see those again as co-constituted, right? I think that's really exciting, but I don't see a lot of that right now in the Theological Academy, and I think that's critically important to theology and the good life.
Yeah. Do you think some of that's inherited from kind of the academic culture in general, this kind of subdisciplinary I mean, the old joke, right? That you do a PhD, you know less, you know more and more about less and less until you know absolutely everything about absolutely nothing. Is that part of just an academic culture that says, well, we should be in our subfields and our subdisciplines? I think it's part of the challenge that we find when people come through for these conversations. We say, we're going to talk about big questions about the field as a whole, and often that can feel, boy, that's really vulnerable. I've been taught to only speak about my particular area of expertise. Is this particular just to theology, or is this something that we're kind of inheriting from the broader academic culture?
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's something that we have inherited from the broader academic culture. I think that is, compellingly and eloquently stated in the Theological Manifesto in terms of the discussion of the research ideal and how that's related to the Theological Academy. But one thing that I at least try to be cautious about, even in my own critique of sort of how all of the various areas, disciplinary areas, seem to be sort of discrete and separate and not really interrelated in the way that they need to be, that in some ways, sort of specialization within particular fields, that's been tremendously promising, right? I mean, that has led to the proliferation of certain knowledges and discourses that have been essential, right, in my opinion, to the advancement of the humanities, of the social sciences, of knowledge in general. So there's something about that I want to affirm, that I don't want to be uncritical about. But I think that within that process, we've lost something, and I think it's about accounting for the limitations, right, of this structure, a way of being in the academy that we have, and that profound loss, and that is that we've lost the kind of sense of integrated whole, right? We have the parts, and that's critically important to the advancement of certain kinds of knowledge, but then how do we think about how then all these parts relate to the whole, this issue of integration? And for me, that seems to be critically what's at stake.
Well, and then it makes me wonder, is that potentially then theology's gift back to the university? Because it seems to me that it's not just theological disciplines that are suffering from that sort of disintegration. And we can see this, I think, a little bit, this kind of hunger for at least on paper, kind of interdisciplinary studies, right? Trying to put the pieces back together. Is it too much for me to hope that divinity schools and theological faculties could kind of be at the vanguard of that sort of reintegration process in our universities?
I'm totally biased, right? I'm biased, and I'm quite arrogant, right, on this, and I recognize that I have colleagues in other areas, good friends who are anthropologists are doing anthropology of religion. They get really upset with this, but I think that theology is poised to be at least in the vanguard. I don't know if theology should consider itself as a savior as such. Right now, me, I wouldn't mind that, but certainly in the vanguard. And I think the reason why, and again, these words are really not my words. I'm borrowing these words from the manifesto, from you and Wolf, and that is because I think that intrinsic to theology is the normative moment. And as the manifesto talked about, part of what's been the problem with the research ideal is sort of the extraction of the normative, right? Now, of course, for fear of all kinds of reasons, because whenever you're talking about the normative or the ethical, there's all kinds of contestation around that and within exclusion. A pluralistic society. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. And always exclusion sitting there. But I think that theology can be in the vanguard because I think the departure point is this robust sense of attempting to envision the world. But not only that, I know there's a lot of conversations on, well, can we speak of theory for theory's sake? Must we speak of theory in service to practice? That theory must have a telos, and it must be, towards a concrete set of practices. I think there are good arguments on both sides, actually. But it seems to me that the Christian vision or an account of Christian theology wants to make the claim that the telos is towards something much larger about the love of God and creation. So.
Yeah, and that's a stirring vision, and it's strikingly particular and Christian, right? When you start to fill it out, and yet you said, and I'm absolutely, we're in agreement on this, that some of the exciting things that are happening right now in theology is a kind of revival of political theology, a revival of public theology, theology able to be done in able to contribute in the public square. I think for some that seems actually like I think that might be surprising to some folks outside the field. They would think, well, what on earth does Christianity have to offer at a kind of pluralistic moment like ours? But how do we navigate that? Both the kind of Christian particularity of our articulation and also a kind of vocation in the public sphere.
Yeah, and maybe I'm wrong, but part of what I sort of hear behind that is how do we articulate that in a way that is not dismissive of the kind of diversity and plurality that is present in the public sphere. And I always like to begin when I'm teaching my introduction to contemporary theological ethics at Bright. I always like to begin by talking about when we're speaking of the Christian tradition, we're sort of always and already speaking about Christian traditions, plural, and kind of the heterogeneous nature from the very beginning, right? Not sort of just slapped on or applied to the Christian tradition, but intrinsic to Christian traditions, the kind of multivocality and plurality that is always there. And so for me, I actually think that Christian traditions already have the internal resources. And I think it's a return to those internal resources that at least, I'm not saying provide the answer, but at least allow those that are seeking to enter Christian theology into the public space, that they're able to navigate and negotiate that in a way that is attentive and cautious to when the claims that we're making might be exclusionary, or even right now when I say exclusionary, there's a whole bunch of literature right now coming out on sort of contesting how we think and uncritically talk about ideas of exclusion. So, but certainly that are not life-giving. I like to say that are not life-giving to others who may not believe what I believe or have a different account of what the good life is. I'm thinking here, for example, of reproductive justice issues, pro-life and pro-choice, and sort of, at least for me, on both sides, I've heard scholars that have really compelling accounts of the good life, deeply rooted in Christian traditions that lead them to that particular position. And so I want to be
different positions.
Different positions, to their positions, different positions. And so I want to sit in that sense of complexity and that ambiguity, but to say that all those internal resources sit within Christian traditions.
Yeah. So in that sense, then the turn towards public theology is a difference of degree, not of kind, from the conversation that happens already among particular Christian traditions. That's really helpful.
Yes.
Well, Keri, I look forward so much to our conversation this week, and thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.